And we couldn't figure out then why in God's name did he pick Riyadh? And then it all gelled. This was not just a negotiation over Russia. This is a negotiation over the Middle East as well, and a negotiation of the New World Order.
Hi, I'm Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics. The U.S. is moving quickly to settle Russia's war with Ukraine. And a lot of people are wondering what will happen to Ukraine, why are the talks happening in Saudi Arabia, and what does this all mean for Europe, Russia, and the U.S. moving forward? George Friedman of Geopolitical Futures gives us his unvarnished views on the negotiations today on Global Macro Update. George Friedman, it's always good to see you in what I would have called unprecedented times, but before we started rolling, you indicated that maybe this isn't so unprecedented. Set the stage for us. What's going on here with our new president?
At times of historical crisis, presidents come in looking to violate the norm because the norm is unsustainable, and they appear to be nearly criminals. When the immigrants started coming to the United States in the early 19th century, Andrew Jackson decided to change the population structure of Georgia. The Supreme Court said he couldn't. He said, well, the Supreme Court orders this, let them enforce it. Franklin Roosevelt had the 100 days. Why 100 days? Because he saw a massive banking crisis. And he saw that he had to massively restructure the banking system. And if he waited 100 days, Congress would get involved. And he wanted to beat that. And he had the famous 100 days for which he was called a dictator, for which the columnist said he was completely unqualified for this office, that he's breaking all norms. And yes, he was breaking our norms. The norms were unsustainable. Personalities aside, and Trump has a strange personality, this is the moment that America had to have this president. I didn't vote for him, but now I think I understand him. He is trying to disrupt America because it's unsustainable. He's now trying to disrupt the world because it's unsustainable. And that's where we are now. The United States has great power. When the president decides to do this, he no longer just does it to the banking system. The whole world explodes.
Let's talk about what's happening as you and I speak, literally. And this is Wednesday, the 19th, and this will air Friday, the 21st. So who knows what will happen in between. But right now, we have a war in Ukraine that is in the process of being potentially settled through a negotiation. You've called this war a failure from Putin's perspective. Do you still feel that way? And if so, why?
The Russian army in 3 years could not overrun what is virtually a third-rate country. It failed. It cost the Russians massive lives, massive positions in the world, and massive amounts of money. And he has nothing to show for it. This has weakened his political position in Russia substantially. There's unrest in Siberia. There are things being written raising the question of what he's doing. Putin, is in political trouble. The way he formulates it is that he's the great victor and aggressor, but now willing to settle on something reasonable on his terms. Well, this is what politicians do, turn failure into success. But the idea that Russia is a great power is gone. If they can't beat Ukraine, who's the next player? Armenia? They are not players, and Trump has realized this.
Was this a war against Ukraine, though, or was it really a proxy war between Russia and the U.S., and that's what's happening, as we're seeing that the new president is saying, enough, I don't want this war?
First of all, we have to remember, the Cold War did not end with the fall of communism. It continued the rivalry between Russia and the West, Russia and the United States. The basic configuration of the geopolitics remained intact. Putin was looking at Ukraine, which is the entryway to Russia historically from the West. He was terrified that after the Maidan Square risings in Ukraine, encouraged by the United States, that the United States intended a move on him. This was under the Democrats. Moscow is just a few hours from the border of Russia and Ukraine. If they reached the Ukrainian border, well, the Americans didn't want that to happen because if they've reached the southern border of Ukraine, they were now on the border of NATO. And they didn't want the Russians on the border of NATO. So there was a very important strategic question to be answered. The United States did not enter the war with troops because it read the Russian army as weak. And we know that the Russian army was catastrophically weak. And there was an attempted coup d'etat in the middle of the war, and it was a mess for the Russians. The Americans cautiously, and the Europeans, brought the Europeans in and gave the Ukrainians weapons. The Russians managed to take a very small portion of Ukraine, at the cost of much life. And the Ukrainians held. Now, when you have a stalemate in a war, you negotiate at the end. When one conquers the other, there's nothing to talk about. When both sides have failed, Ukraine can't drive Russia out. Europe is not sending troops to drive the Russians back, and we'd be crazy to get involved. This would be worse than another Vietnam. Therefore, there has to be a negotiation. Now, this is the time when all the people who know that they're not going to war demand that the war continue.
How do you settle a war without all the participants at the table?
Well, the participants are the Americans and the Russians. Russia was using this war to declare that it is back as a major power, having conquered Ukraine, and to deal with the United States. It's terrified of the United States. The United States could not let the Russians come to the NATO border, but could not send troops. This was a war between the U.S. and Russia on Ukrainian soil. The Americans solved it with superior weaponry and dedicated Ukrainian population, and the Russians failed. So the war, I regard this war not between Russia and Ukraine, but a ballet between Russia and America with Ukraine as a stage.
So there's a lot happening on X, formerly known as Twitter right now, with the president shooting out information. Earlier, he called Zelensky a dictator without elections. And there's something being passed around that Marco Rubio, or current Secretary of State, posted back in 2022, March 15th of 22. He wrote, Putin still wants to capture Kyiv and install a puppet government. But when he realizes that's not feasible, he will, one, focus on destroying as much of Ukraine's defenses as possible, and two, offer a ceasefire that imposes neutrality on Ukraine and recognizes Crimea and the Donbass as part of Russia.
And the United States will give him that in return for major concessions on the part of the Russians. We're now Ukraine negotiating. Now, you guys are businessmen or deal with businessmen, and you know what a negotiation looks like. The first thing you say is, I don't want to negotiate. The second thing you say is, you're a thief. And the wording goes on. So at this point, pay no attention to what's being said. Pay attention to what's being done.
So this president very often has multiple balls in the air, right? Lots of plates spinning. It's never just about one thing. So I want to kind of touch on some of the other things that seem to be happening out in isolation, but maybe they're related. I'm not sure. I'd love your opinion. First, the negotiations are happening in Saudi Arabia, which I found interesting. What is the significance of that?
Trump is also trying to redesign the world. He sees the current world as irrational. Now, mind you, I didn't vote for Trump. Personally, I don't like Trump, but the guy knows what he's doing. Europe is a place. It is not a nation. It is fragmentary elements. You don't have any reliance on the Europeans. Russia is not crippled, but weakened by this war. China is suffering economic downturns and is now reaching out to the Japanese to form an alliance, which is funny. So we are the superpower. This is our opportunity to insert ourselves in a situation and create a new world order, if you will. And what is going on right now in Saudi Arabia is, and I was surprised that they went to Saudi Arabia. I thought they'd go to Hungary, for Viktor Orban was a friend of both presidents, and negotiate there. But then he pulled another stunt, Gaza. Gaza made no sense. We're going to go to Gaza, we're going to own Gaza, we're going to occupy Gaza, we're going to build a Riviera in Gaza. All insane words. But he understands something else. The Arab-Israeli wars have begun in 1948 and never stopped. They've got to stop. The key is how to stop it. Well, one, Gaza is a strategic territory. But second, he must recruit the Arabs into a peace agreement, finally. And the only nation that can do that, there are two. One is Iran, possibly, unlikely. You don't want to have their dominating the region. Or Saudi Arabia, part of the Abraham Accords. By going to Saudi Arabia, he basically brought Saudi Arabia into the realm of great powers. Now the three major oil producers, remember that, are sitting at the table deciding the fate of Europe. The Europeans are not sitting at the table deciding the fate of the Middle East or anything. They've been excluded. And I think Trump has decided the Russians are going to be very useful in this, if they're afraid, to some extent. The Saudis are very useful powers. Now, this is finally being leaked in the newspapers, but I want you to know, we published this Monday morning. I'm not trying to make myself look good, but I'm trying to make myself look good.
I read it. That's why I wanted to speak with you. And then you're talking about you're saying geopolitical futures.
Geopolitical futures did that. And because we couldn't figure out what the hell he was talking about in Gaza, and we couldn't figure out then why in God's name did he pick Riyadh for a place for negotiations with the Russians. And then it all gelled. This was not just a negotiation over Russia. This is a negotiation over the Middle East as well. And a negotiation of how the New World Order, which will include the Russians, will include the Saudis, and include Americans. The most important thing is to understand there is no fundamental difference between the United States and Russia at this point. Communism is gone. They're all businessmen or thieves or something. They're not going to invade Europe. World War II settled that question. We do not have to guarantee European security. If by now they can't guarantee themselves, they're not going to do a third world war. Russia has interests badly in dealing with the United States. The United States wants to get over being responsible for every country that might be attacked, and economic relations, and they trap China. A Russian-China entente, a Russian-American entente traps China. So from a strategic point of view, this is pretty cool stuff.
If you like these types of conversations, please take a minute to subscribe, give us a like, and leave us a comment. I read them all. And if you want more detailed analysis, along with my own thoughts on these issues, sign up for my Global Macro Update newsletter. It's free. You'll find a link in the description below. And now back to our conversation with George Friedman. I wanted to bring in China, so I'm glad you brought it up, because Russia and Ukraine both are very resource wealthy nations. Ukraine, Trump has openly talked about a mineral deal where we'll help settle this, but we want access to your rare earths.
We'll buy them.
Yes, buy.
He'd like to say give it, but
But a lot of these resources come from a couple of places, right? I mean, they all come from that broader part of the world. They come from Kazakhstan or Russia or Ukraine or China. Is this a move to also box China out?
China is a much weaker power than most think. Their economy is a shambles. Really, it's in bad shape. Their navy is a bluff. They haven't invaded Taiwan because they can't. It takes 10 hours for a landing craft to reach Taiwan. In those 10 hours, American satellites will notice it. Hey, there's an invasion coming. And Guam's missiles will open up on that mission. The idea of an invasion of Taiwan is absurd, which is why they didn't do it. But they were superb in trying to make themselves appear a superpower. Now, today, Xi held a speech saying that he wanted the private sector, not the government, the private sector to have more freedom to develop the economy. In other words, he's endangering the ideology and the governance of China now, but he has to. So one of the big questions is, what does China do? But the question always in geopolitics is, what can it do? Do internal reforms and try to find an ally. So who did he reach out today to? Japan. Japan wants its old enemy that invaded it. Japan wants an alliance with China for economic reasons, be interesting, but doesn't trust China. So what you see is what I call an unanchored world. Once Russia failed in the invasion of Ukraine, and it lost, the world became unleashed, where everybody during the Cold War took their bearings from, am I with Russia? Am I with America? Am I neutral? There is no center of gravity, no central confrontation in the world now. Everything is in play, everywhere. So, Japanese relationship with the United States, if Japan goes with China, enjoy. The Chinese, because this is what Trump wants, a world where he's not responsible for the world. And the Chinese are isolated, the Europeans fragmented and in chaos as to what they're going to do. So what he has done to the world is what he did to Washington. Break the norm. And he's doing it fast because he understands he only has so much time before everybody gets organized. And he's moving at flank speed, creating disruption to restructure it. Now, I didn't think he was this smart, but he is.
Having 4 years in between terms probably played to his advantage, I would think.
I don't know what it was. He might have spoken to God or several advisors. But what happens here is that his actions are understandable. Now, the media deliberately does not want to understand them or puts wrong interpretations. But when we stand back and take a look at a weaker and friendly Russia to the United States, a fragmented Europe where NATO is no longer an issue, where the European Union is no longer an entity, we deal with European countries one at a time, and a China that's isolated from any major ally, well, now you see a very different world, and a very secure world for America. So we can have chaos at home next.
I know this is kind of a what do you think question, but I can't resist asking. I mean, what does Putin make of all this, and how does he react to it, knowing that there will be a different president in 4 years?
Putin has failed. Putin could not win this war. Putin instead isolated Russia, damaged its economy severely, killed many more Russians than anyone would think, has unrest in Siberia, and has shown itself to be inherently weak. Now, the Cold War at least made the Russians strong, militarily, if not economically. The rise of Putin was to resurrect the Cold War, because remember, we had Gorbachev and other losers running Russia. Putin emerges and says, wait a minute, we're great Russia. I will restore Russia. And he plays as if he's a superpower. But he's shown that he's not. And he's cost a great deal. So can Putin survive is one of the great questions. Can Xi survive is an interesting question. Can Trump survive? That ain't a question. He and the Saudis are the only ones sure to be here next year. Now that reverses the press, which has Trump desperately trying to get something going, Putin in a powerful position, and the Chinese about to invade America. So we're kind of a contrarian view, but there it is.
Well, let's bring it back to Ukraine, George. This is fascinating. I always love getting your take. But this is some of the rumors that I've heard for settlement. Permanent neutrality for Ukraine. Guarantor nations, which would include China, the U.S., I believe the UK, and potentially Saudi Arabia. Guarantor nations would have veto rights over certain activities in Ukraine, and they would guarantee Ukraine's security, and that Ukraine would be disarmed.
That's such a complicated settlement. It could not be implemented. Too many countries, everything. The Europeans aren't a country. They're a continent. There are a bunch of countries. The Poles said, hell no. Only the French wanted to go. And as is always the case in Europe, who'll follow the French? This was a French idea, and nobody else said they would do it. So the idea of the Europeans guaranteeing Ukraine, which means being on the battle line with the Russians if the Russians double-crossed or are able to, this is a non-starter in the Europeans. The neutrality of Ukraine is guaranteed if the Americans get what they want, what little they want, the minerals, and the Russians get a guarantee that NATO won't come into Ukraine. But at this point, NATO doesn't exist anymore, except for holding meetings, dinners, bar mitzvahs, whatever they do. NATO was an army under the command of Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, with a treaty saying that if Russia attacks, all countries will be engaged, not under their national command, but under, well, Eisenhower at one point, and, this was the war. At this point, NATO is a come-as-you-are party. As we saw in the Ukraine, NATO could not make a concerted response except to give things that don't kill people, that don't kill their own people. So when we look at Europe, we look at it return to the pre-1945 model. Not in the same way of ideology and so on, but these are fragmental nations following different policies with different characteristics. So a European guarantee is what? On the other hand, Ukrainian neutrality is guaranteed by the fact that no one cares about Ukraine. The tragic truth of the matter was, Ukraine was kind of the battlefield of the change, but itself has no importance. But the Russians had hardly took any territory from the Ukrainians. They failed miserably. So they give up a little land, they get some peace, they get some aid from the United States. The French will give them advice, and the Russians will not bother them. Ukrainians end up damaged tragically. But this is history, and it's not kind.
Does it get rebuilt?
It'll get rebuilt like we rebuilt Germany. We rebuilt Japan, made them allies. The U.S. has a policy, a very wise one. After we kick someone's ass, give them a dinner, some clothing, make them happy. What we did for Germany and Japan was resurrect them from defeat and turn them into allies. Losing to the United States would have been a great bonus to the Ukrainians. Losing to the Russians, well, the Russians know the Americans will want this resurrection. They can't turn Ukraine into a desert. And part of the deal will be a joint resurrection of Ukraine on a neutral basis. Since neutrality used to mean not being with the Russians and not being with the Americans, that loses its meaning now if the Russians and the Americans pull closer.
Everything that's happening, does it change your framework, how you look at geopolitics? I mean, you've said to me many, many times that the presidency isn't very powerful, that the president can't do much.
Any president would have done this. We were stable with the Russians because we didn't bother them as a country. There was no threat of the Russians taking over Europe. Russia was an obsession because it takes time for Americans to grasp reality, which is that what are we doing worrying about the Russians? We have the Chinese to worry about, we focused on. So everybody we're at war with? And every president would understand that we came to Entente when we won World War II. We came to it when we essentially contributed to winning World War I. We made peace with the Confederates after the Civil War. The war ended when the Soviet Union collapsed, but continued on a kind of guerrilla warfare, diplomatic warfare basis for no point to another. We had no fundamental issue with Russia. So at some point, a president will come along and say, why do I have a Russian war plan in my hand? And say, this is not what I need. And we'll say, what Viktor Orban said in Hungary, the Cold War is over. Why don't you guys get together? Now, they needed to be, Putin needed to be in a desperate position to do this because he wanted to resurrect Russia. The Democrats were paralyzed by too many years in power. It's hard, you get into a routine, and then when the world changes and shifts, you have trouble changing and shifting with it. So old norms come in. And the Republicans would have ripped them apart. I mean, they would have just, Trump would have attacked them for being capitulationists or whatever. So the politics of the United States was the one that prevented an understanding with Russia. Now that understanding with Russia will be reached over Ukraine. And that will redefine where all the players go. So presidents do not do what they want. They do what they must do. And the must do is put to them by reality. Not all presidents can do that because sometimes reality is unimportant, minor, and other times they're stupid and they get voted out of office. But it was inevitable that this pseudo Cold War with Russia come to an end because we had one world. Do not let China and Russia unite. That would have been a nightmare. On the other hand, the Russians and the Chinese hate each other. Russia, when Kissinger was in China negotiating Mao Zedong, the Russians attacked the Ussuri River. The Russians and the Chinese have been fighting wars for a very long time. The idea that they were communists who would now unite them turned false during those talks. And so we didn't understand that Americans frequently are moralists and think that everybody operates on moral principle and love. And the Chinese hated each other. They were just, what were they going to do except unite against the United States and not do anything? So remember that politicians are not magicians. Politicians become presidents because they understand reality, at least for a while. And if they're not realists, they're not going to get there. They understand the American people at this moment in time, the American problem at this time in time, and the foreign leaders, what they were. There were great presidents in this, like Roosevelt, like others, in foreign policy and domestic policy. There were terrible presidents, but the United States has room for failure. Other countries don't. So this is something that normally happens to the United States. It was interesting that the chief media, particularly one or two columnists, regarded Roosevelt as completely unfit to be elected president, that he was an alien man. And when he did the things in the banks, he was accused of being a dictator. And when the Supreme Court ruled against him, he decided to expand the Supreme Court and appoint new justices to outvote them. Didn't work. So we have a long history of how very efficient foreign policy leaders, which Roosevelt was, also handled domestic politics in the same way. Unprincipled and self-righteous.
So this abnormal period that we find ourselves in is actually quite normal historically.
Well, historically, in World War I, we went in order to prevent the German conquest of Europe. Then the Europeans let that slide by not containing Germany, and it started again. After World War II, he said, we're not going to trust the Europeans anymore. We're going to run the show, and we're going to get the Europeans part of our army, and we'll call it NATO. And this time the Russians didn't come. This time the Europeans thought they were going to form a relationship with the Russians. Then the Russians turned out to be Russians and tried to invade Ukraine. And this time the United States said, all right, we've been doing this for a century. Let's play a different game.
George, I'm just starting to work my way through the geopolitical futures 2025 forecast. It's excellent as usual. I can't recommend it enough. I can't resist asking you one last question. Greenland. What is going on there?
Trump is trying to prove something in the Western Hemisphere. The old rules don't work and they aren't going to be followed. So he is opposed of being a rule breaker. He breaks the norm. And he's saying the norm sucks. I'm going to break it. I'm going to do crazy things. Gaza was crazy. But it got Saudi Arabia into the deal. Now, that's why they're holding the summit in Saudi Arabia, because they're not only talking about Ukraine, they're talking about Israel and the Arab world, that we've got to stop this. So, at time of abnormal strife inside of a country, presidents arise, like Andrew Jackson, like Roosevelt, apparently like Trump, who see that the norm has to be broken. And I should add that Roosevelt broke the norm with the banking system, broke the law like crazy, violated the law. He didn't have the power to do what he did. He did it in 100 days because he knew Congress would be back, would stop him. Trump played Roosevelt's hand. He's doing it so fast because he knows Congress will be back to stop him, and the courts and everything else. He's creating realities. In the meantime, he throws out crazy things like Canada becoming part of the United States. Everybody's hitting the wrong issue. He's free to hit the right issue. Now, if his instincts are doing this, they're good instincts. But I think he's thinking this through. I think this time he came to office knowing what had to be done.
George, I always appreciate the perspective. Thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure.
I enjoyed it.